Hi guys, in this video I'm going to consider a couple of features that are formed along the coastline because of the process of longshore drift, which is our transportation process. Now, I'm going to consider a spit, but it's the same process of the formation of a bar or a tombolo, but I'll talk about that at the end. So what we had in our last video, we talked about how this beach material is moved in a zigzag movement up and down the beach really, but the main thing is it's moved along. Now, the beach is constantly moving. Now, what happens is sometimes the land will suddenly end. Now, that could be because the coastline's ended or there's a river or whatever reason. The UK is not a block, it's not a square. And if it was, then it would have a couple of edges where the land stopped. So all we have to remember here is that the beach material will carry on moving up the beach until the land stops. And in this instance, we're going to consider that this is a river kind of flowing out, quite a large river with kind of a wide mouth. So here we've got the land ended, as you can see here from my green pattern. But the beach doesn't really know that the land has ended. So the longshore drift just continues, and it continues moving that beach material out into the sea now because there's no land behind it because this is a river. And that beach now, because we just use different words in geography, that beach now isn't called a beach anymore. That beach that goes into the sea, which is essentially all it is, that's what we call a spit. So a spit is essentially beach material that has no land at the back of it, that the longshore drifters carried on taking this beach material out into the sea. Now what happens is it just doesn't go on and on and on and on and on, because essentially we've got some water maybe coming out here because this is a river, and we also have waves hitting the end of it. So what we end up happening is that the beach will carry on, but the end of the beach, it will be eroded or removed by any waves or by any water that's coming out of the river. And so we end up with this, what we call recurved end of the spit, okay, which just means it's kind of, because of the waves, it's just kind of moving in. So that is how a spit is formed, okay? We've said the movement of the beach along due to longshore drift, the land ends, but the beach continues into the sea, but we don't call it a beach anymore, we call it a spit. Now, the interesting thing is what happens behind the spit, because we can have things called salt marshes. Now, down here in Kent, we have many salt marshes, and some of you might live in places which also have salt marsh. So what happens here is this area behind the spit is very sheltered. And all the time, waves and wind are blowing quite a lot of material, beach material, into this area at the back. Now, if there's a river coming out as well, then that will be depositing material here as well. So over time, what happens here is that we get a build-up of material and it becomes higher and higher and higher. Now, during high tide, it will be covered. During low tide, it won't be. So that will be kind of that will be a marsh area and quite kind of clay with a lot of kind of mud and things like that. But over time, salt tolerant plants begin to grow, especially because it's covered during high tide and then not covered at low tide. So halophytes, which is what we call salt tolerant plants, start to grow, and eventually because of the cycle of decay, life and decay of those plants, they will add organic material and height to this as well. So over time, this area at the back becomes higher and higher. Now remember, it comes higher and higher for a couple of reasons. The wind is blowing sand onto it, the river is depositing sediment, and also these plants are dying. Now when those plants die, they become obviously organic material, and because the area is building up, it doesn't get covered as much over time by the tide every time the tide comes in. So over time it gets higher and higher and higher, and less salt tolerant plants are able to grow there because it's not always covered by water. So the more plants that grow there, the more plants die, the more organic matter gets deposited there, but also the higher the land becomes. So over time, this actually ends up becoming land. Now, it will always be quite boggy and quite marshy because it is at quite low levels, and at very high tides or during storms, it will be flooded. So we don't get like massive oak trees and things growing here, but it is what we call a salt marsh. So the salt marsh at the back will eventually become land, and then people often use this, farmers use it for maybe growing crops, but generally for keeping sheep. There might be a caravan park there could be a golf course, etc. So we do get land here eventually, and that land will end up with some human use on it. So that is the formation of a spit. Now, the two other things that you'll find that you need to learn are a bar, which basically means if I'd have drawn the other bit of land here, so that's my river coming out, if I've got another piece of land here, this spit may well eventually hit the other piece of land where I've got my hand. So what you'll end up behind is that you'll have a lagoon, as long as the river's not too big, because if the river's too wide, then it will wash away the spit. Now that's generally why we don't get spits across rivers, because generally if we look at the Thames, for example, or some of the other big rivers around the UK, they're very powerful with a lot of water. So they would generally wash this spit away. But with rivers that aren't running so much, that used to have a lot of water in but haven't now, the water, the amount of water, the discharge of that won't be enough to wash away the spit. So the spit will form. And that spit, if it hits the land here, like I just said, is called a bar. And this will be a lagoon at the back. And down on the south coast of the UK, we've got a place called Portland, which is a little island. And the spit actually hits the island, if I use my fist as the island of Portland, and it hits the island. And now this is called a tombolo, okay? Don't get it confused with the tombola, because that's where you get raffle. It's a raffle and you get prizes. You don't get any prizes for this. So it's a island, and the spit hits the island. It's called a tombolo, but it's exactly the same principles of this movement of sediment through longshore drift. So that is the formation of spits.